This is ContactTalkRadio.com. Consciousness in action. And you are taking action into your consciousness by tuning into Contact Talk Radio.
And on TuneIn.com, Ping.fm, and UpSnap Mobile.
Contact Talk Radio.
Throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, SHERI Horn Hasan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on May 5th, 2022 from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. So first, my usual housekeeping stuff, which is just to reiterate that you can listen to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast anytime by simply going to my website at karmicevolution.com and clicking on the upper right-hand portion of the banner labeled podcast. From there, you can scroll down the page and hear the most recent show, either live or recorded, and or search the archived listings for past shows that you might have missed or ones to which you'd like to listen again. Separately, I'd be thrilled if you would follow me on my Facebook page, which is Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, and that's where you can sign up for my Conversations About Consciousness newsletter as well. And finally, I'm offering still my 1-hour discounted Karmic Evolution Natal Insight Reader to listeners only for only $99. And this reading is for those of you who are interested in astrology. Often when people come to me, they've been studying it for a little while, or they've been dabbling in it, etc. You know, so many of us spend years reading our monthly horoscopes and then want to get a little bit deeper into it and or want to really learn more about our own charts. So this reading is essentially a snapshot of the exact position of the planets at the precise moment and location of your birth. And because of that, it gives us a kind of blueprint for your soul. And when you place that chart in the hands of a qualified astrologer, it can be used to reveal a great deal about you and as a tool for greater soul growth. So it can be tremendously helpful to learn your soul's true purpose and how you can move towards your highest destiny in this lifetime, to identify patterns of behavior that originated early in life and or during past lives, and how those patterns might be affecting your current relationships, your choice of career or job, your finances and or your health, and to perhaps begin to understand that these patterns of behavior are really based on soul conditioning, and that such conditioning has become habit, but that these patterns of behavior may no longer serve your soul's karmic evolution or evolutionary journey as you move forward in this lifetime. So this reading can help you gain insight into what may have tripped you up in the past and how to entertain new perspectives and gain greater awareness. However, one of the things that I like to say that it really I've discovered through my work on past life regression and reading the chart from the evolutionary point of view is that all of this is really for the purpose of being able to look at our lives through the lens of potential past life karma in order to better understand our behavior today, but also to see it through the lens of self-compassion. Why did we do certain things? Why did we take certain actions? Why did we make certain choices in the past that, again, have may become part of our soul's conditioned responses to stimuli and relationships and circumstances now? And, you know, to see why we made those decisions and to understand them better. Because no reading, of course, is about using an explanation of potential karma, past karma, to guilt or blame or shame anyone into making changes now. No, it's about being able to look at your life from a little bit more objective or removed lens, as though you were a character in a movie, and then to say, oh my God, I can see why I feel that way now. Wow, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, now I can have compassion for myself. So anyway, all of this is easier to understand when you take advantage of my 1-hour discounted Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $99. Simply email me at Sheri, that's SHERI, at karmicevolution.com, and we can get your reading scheduled as soon as possible. I like to say at almost half the regular price, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. All right, so meanwhile, let's get on now to this week's Astro news you can use. I think it's pretty obvious there's a lot going on, as there has been for a while, but particularly this week. So we're going to get into that, specifics of that in just a minute. But first, the monthly lunar cycle's waxing now since April 30th, Taurus new moon solar eclipse. And this means that we're still being asked to continue to weed out our inner gardens of any old, outdated values that no longer serve us in the here and now present. When the Taurus moon and sun came together then, we wanted to plant more of what we value most since our lives have changed, particularly since Uranus's ingress into Taurus in the spring of 2018, which called for a change in values. In short, the question we can ask ourselves now is, do we espouse the same values now that we did, say, 10, 20, 30, 40, or in some, in the case of actually the United States of America as a nation, nearly 250 years ago? Or might some of these have changed with the times since then? And we may ponder such issues now as the monthly lunar cycle again continues to wax until we hit the May 16th, 15th, or 16th, depending on your time zone, Scorpio full moon lunar eclipse. Now, pondering these issues during this in-between eclipse period can help us see where we may have been stuck or have became stuck in a kind of daydream or fantasy of the perfect past, without having acknowledged that no matter how perfect things seemed then, they may not be so wonderful now. Let's take things like voodoo economics. That's just one tiny little example, right? Everybody thought it was so great then, and even Alan Greenspan, who was the originator of the whole theory, trickle-down economics, has acknowledged that, oh gosh, it doesn't work. So it needs to be replaced with something else. So we might realize now that clinging to an old value system, both personal or societal, may no longer suit our current lives or our current circumstances, especially in terms of future potential personal and or collective growth. So if we can do this now, or we can continue to do this now, when the time comes to release our old, outdated, irrelevant values at the Scorpio full moon lunar eclipse, we'll be ready. And this eclipse, just as a reminder, occurs at 25 degrees and 28 minutes of Scorpio at 9:14 p.m. Pacific on May 15th and 12:14 a.m. Eastern on the 16th. However, between now and then, especially since Pluto, the ruler of Scorpio, is retrograde now in Capricorn until October 8th, we may want to examine as well how this older set of values may actually reveal to us now how they're based somewhat on the more, our formerly repressed shadow side, which is something that we fear. So, again, in other words, it's kind of like, let's just go back to trickle-down economics for a second. The whole point was we feared inequality in the country, theoretically, so they developed a theory that actually promoted inequality on the financial level anyway. But the fear was that those who had money were going to lose it, So there's a lot of highways and byways to get into there on the psychological level. But what I'm trying to point out is that our old values were based on our fears. And Pluto in Capricorn retrograde now gives us the ability to go deep and discern what is part of our shadow side. So, and that's particularly themes related to Saturn ruled Capricorn, because Pluto's retrograding through Capricorn. And that Capricorn represents business, the building of foundational foundational structures, and security, and meaning the kind of security that we gain through the accrual of resources. So, and then that combines with Pluto, ruling joint resources and other people's wealth, deep abiding loyalty and trust, and the ever popular Platonic theme of sexuality and sexual bonding. So I've said before that I believe that Pluto in Capricorn, where the god of the underworld, which is a metaphor for the unconscious in Jungian psychological terms, has been transiting since November 2008, represents what I call death, which is to be read as transformation, to business as usual. And we saw that at Pluto's ingress into Capricorn, which marked the fall of the U.S. housing market, which in turn precipitated huge losses of equity for many homeowners across the country. And of course, equity in our homes, for those of us who own one or mortgage one, is a large part of our personal wealth. So that was, pretty devastating. So why did that happen? I mean, likely because Pluto previously brought excessive expansionary energy to money lending, joint resources, when he, the god of wealth and hidden riches, was in Sagittarius from 1995 until late 2008. However, now, as Pluto gets ready to exit Capricorn and to enter Aquarius, which he's going to do for the first time on March 24th of 2023, after which he'll retrograde back into Capricorn twice, from June 10th, 2023 to January 21st, 2024, and again from September 2nd of 2024 through November 19th of 2024, which is when he'll enter Pisces for the long term on March 8th, until March 8th of 2043, 2024 to 2043. I mean, that's a long time. And yes, that's nearly 20 years altogether that Pluto is going to spend transiting through Pisces when he's done with, I'm sorry, not Pisces, through Aries. Hang on. I'm sorry, through Aquarius. I don't know why I wrote Pisces. I had Pisces on the brain. Through Aquarius, right, when he's done with Capricorn. And the reason for the disparity in how many years Pluto spends transiting through a sign is because the orbit of Pluto is elliptical rather than round. So it moves irregularly through the signs, unlike, say, the faster moving planets like, the moon or the sun, which are pretty standard, 27 and a half days through the month, or 365 days through the year, give or take the adjustment we make with our, modern calendars. But I digress. So I'm giving you this background, for a reason, but it's usually when a planet enters or ingresses a new sign, or and begins to leave an old sign, that we feel its impact most profoundly. So Pluto's ingress into Capricorn in November of 2008 is a perfect example for those, and I'm mentioning it because we're going to get ready to look forward to Pluto and Aquarius, right? So for those who remember the demise of Wall Street's Lehman Brothers in late 2008, and the other tremendous shakeups in the financial world, particularly related to the savings and loan institutions, which happen to oversee mortgages in this country, as well as related to the outcome of the introduction of, or I should say the outcome. I mean, I think the chickens coming home to roost of the repercussions. That's the word I'm looking for. The repercussions from the introduction earlier when Pluto was in Sag to packaged securities, particularly again related to the housing market and to real estate, such as the REITs or the real estate investment trusts, a good number of which went bust at that time when Pluto went into Capricorn, losing investors and homeowners millions of dollars. Now, financial institutions fall under both Pluto and Capricorn's domains. The former because it's where joint resources are held by banks, insurance, and brokerage firms, and the latter because it represents the foundation, as I said, upon which rests our equity, which in turn represents our foundational sense of security in this lifetime. So death or transformations to these things certainly occurred during Pluto's run through Capricorn, right? Now, I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. I've posited that the period during which Pluto first enters Aquarius in March 2023 and his final exit from Capricorn in November of 2024 may well mimic the movement of Saturn when it moved into Aquarius from March 22nd, 2020, but then retrograded back into Capricorn on July 2nd of 2020. We may recall that this was the period when Saturn first moved into Aquarius, when the police officer Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, and during which people took to the streets to protest for justice or to protest social injustice. The clash between citizens and the more militarized police forces throughout the nation violated the civil rights of many and highlighted even more the kind of police brutality people were protesting against in the first place. So again, Pluto and Capricorn. Pluto is power, and Capricorn is, a structural foundation. It doesn't represent necessarily the military, but it's more about bureaucracy, right? And about authority figures. So the clash between the average citizens who want change and those who are institutionalized against change was, a big part of that whole conflict. So when Saturn retrograded back into Capricorn from July 2nd of 2020 through December 17th of 2020, we had the U.S. presidential election as Saturn returned to a kind of business as usual decorum that promoted foundational theories and, Neptune's in Pisces and, squared the nodes during that period. So most of these theories were fictional, and they questioned both the makeup of the protesters. I don't know if anybody remembers that, and they did the same thing during the January 6th Capitol riot, right? That the protesters were actually Antifa, left-wing Antifa dressed up as MAGA supporters so that, people wouldn't shoot them or whatever. I don't know. But the point is that during this period, the validity of the election itself was questioned, and it took root as a conspiracy theory. So needless to say, this period was fraught. And it's one that led ultimately to the assault on the Capitol, U.S. Capitol on January 6th of 2020. So let's get back for a second to Pluto's pending ingress into Aquarius and its future retrogrades back into Capricorn, because I theorize that we're going to see, not just in the U.S., but globally, since protests also took place all over the world during Saturn's Aquarian ingress in 2020, that will be similar to the street protests we saw here and abroad during this time. So with this as a backdrop, as well as the recently previously much anticipated Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Pisces from April 12th, and the recent Taurus new moon solar eclipse on April 30th, now let's look at what's happening in the microcosm as we experience the last dying gasps of Pluto in Capricorn, some of which will happen during its upcoming retrograde period. It's retrograde now, and it's upcoming retrogrades after it enters Aquarius in March of 2023. So Pluto represents all that we fear looking at, as I said, and acknowledging these things about ourselves so that we don't stuff them into that underworld of our unconscious. These things, if we do so, they only come out in the form of the behavior or of others or circumstances that we draw to us, because when we bury these things that we're too scared to look at because they seem too horrible to acknowledge about ourselves, then they get projected out and we attract them back to us in the form of others or other circumstances. So it's now, again, between the Taurus new moon solar eclipse and the upcoming Scorpio full moon lunar eclipse that we can go a long way toward helping distinguish between what we need to release from our subconscious and bring into our ego consciousness so that we may look at it with fresh eyes and a new emotional nature, because doing so can go a long way towards replacing any of our old, outdated values with more relevant ones, as I previously noted. Why? To ensure that we reform our old ideas, our thoughts, our beliefs, and values into new ones more appropriate to our current times. And, our future growth, both personally and collectively, depends on this kind of evolutionary progress. So the Jupiter-Neptune in Pisces conjunction that happens only once every 166 years in that sign, that is, the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction happens roughly every 12 to 13 years, but in a different sign. It just takes 166 years to come back around again to Pisces, as it did recently. And while this may have led to heightened spiritual awareness for some, and is continuing to do so, it also has repercussions in the sense that this was a particularly, fantastical, dreamy, visionary combination. So, I've discussed before the watery nature of Neptune, particularly during its transit through Pisces, which began in early February of 2012 and won't end until this collective energy enters Aries on March 31st of 2025, and how it represents the undercurrents of the collective unconscious. So Neptune is going to retrograde back into Pisces only once after it goes into Aries on March 31st of 2025, and that will be from October 25th of 2025 to January 27th of 2026, before he settles into Aries until May 22nd, 2038. So we're looking at the potential for all issues Piscean to bubble up into consciousness within the collective between now and early 2026. Now, it seems clear at this point, all issues related to water and water's resonance with emotions, along with Neptune and Pisces' resonance with our unconscious, and that's both collectively and personally, make and have made us all part of an awakening process. And that's if we've chosen to use it as such, right? We can choose to stay in the dream and the fantasy, which is something I've talked about previously, or we can wake up and go, okay, what's changed? What's the difference now between then and now? So the recent Russian war against Ukraine, which I've discussed at length over the past 2 months or so, provides us a good illustration of how the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Pisces has awakened us all to a greater resonance with universal compassion for those suffering and dying now. And in the shorter term, as Venus transits through proactive warrior-like Aries from May 2nd through the 28th, and the Taurus Sun joined Uranus earlier today on May 5th, we've been shocked into sudden action since the announcement earlier this week of the leaked Supreme Court draft decision written by one of the court's most conservative originalist justices, Samuel Alito, that strikes down the court's previous 1973 Roe versus Wade precedent that established the constitutional right of women to have control over their own bodies. Alito's draft, if signed onto by the court's majority, would abolish this right because it demands the whole issue. Because it remands the whole issue to the federal legislature, meaning Congress. Alito essentially says that there's nothing in the original Constitution that gives women this right. So meanwhile, if Congress doesn't act to codify Roe versus Wade into federal law, this would set into motion leaving the legality of abortion up to each individual state to decide. And here again, I mentioned, which I've mentioned many times before, that over the past 2 years or so at least, but something that came to really the height of our attention after the November 2020 presidential election is the split between the states and the federal government, which is obvious in the ploy that I'll just leave it general and say people in power tried to pull on everyone else that states' electors could be changed in order to change the outcome of each state's votes for a presidential candidate after the fact. And that doesn't even count the fact also that, many of our past, most recent presidents were not elected by the popular vote. Rather, they were elected by the electoral vote. And that's a whole nother story I'm not going to get into right now. Anyway, bear in mind that Mercury's been in his shadow period since last week, around the end of April, and will station retrograde at 4 degrees, 51 minutes Gemini on May 10th. Now, he'll remain retrograde until June 3rd. So combined with the shock surrounding the sudden leaks, and I want to say that Sun joined Uranus this morning at 3:22 a.m. Pacific and 12:22 a.m. Eastern time on May 5th, right? And that this followed yesterday's Mars sextile to Uranus. So we have a lot of Uranian energy here, which of course is groups and sudden movement, etc. But that this energy is, one that manifested, or these energies manifested prior to their perfection, because the draft, Alito's draft, Supreme Court decision on Roe versus Wade draft was leaked and hit the news on Tuesday night, May 3rd. So the reason I'm harping on it is because you see there's about a day and a half to 2 days between, and on Tuesday, Jupiter sextiles Pluto. Pluto is secrets and Jupiter is expansion, right? Or release or whatever. So we have, this 2 to 2.5 day Jupiter sextile Pluto at 6:30 p.m., which is probably around the time most of us started hearing about this story, especially news watchers like me. And then the whole entire next day, and then by 3:30 or 3:30 12:30 a.m., depending on your time zone, the people had immediately taken to the streets, right? So what I'm saying here is that Mercury entered its shadow, something was unearthed in the form of communication, written communication, that shocked us. So combined with the shock surrounding this sudden leak's potential demise of women's rights in this country, and bear in mind that the U.S. would be only one of a handful of countries globally to do this. and that none of them are, none of the other countries that restrict abortion or outlaw it altogether are major players in the world's economy, which is interesting. You can Google it and see the list of countries that forbid abortion or regulate in some fashion. But the fallout has already proven to mobilize women and other abortion rights activists around the U.S. already. Now, Venus in Aries, again, she went in on May 2nd, right, which was Monday. So we had this series of events. May 2nd, she goes into Aries. On the 3rd, we have the announced leak. On the 4th, we have, Mars sextiling Uranus saying, wait a minute, we're going to mobilize. And then we have the Sun conjunct Uranus. And the last two, I do believe, were already in play because when they're waxing, these energies are strongest. So people took to the streets pretty much immediately, and they will continue to do so. So, and part of that is because Aries, Venus in Aries is a fighter. So she's going to fight to defend the natural cycles of life or die trying, as we've already begun to see by those who've been gathering on the steps of the United States Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. and in state capitals, as I mentioned thus far. This is an issue of autonomy, right? Which is freedom, autonomy over one's own body and the right to choose. So Mercury's retrograde period, which again starts next week on May 10th, but lasts until June 3rd, while the Supreme Court's final decision isn't expected until late June or early July, and though Mercury remains in its shadow period until it hits the degree at which it's stationed retrograde, which is 451 of Gemini on June 19th, this period may well have some of the other conservative justices rethinking Alito's arguments and cause them to take a softer stance, which might prove to be not abolishing abortion totally by striking down Roe versus Wade, but rather through upholding the Mississippi case on which this decision now hinges, that revolves around shortening the legal time period during which one might get a legal abortion from 22 weeks down to 14. So as Venus progresses through Aries for most of the rest of May, Jupiter's going to join her there on May 10th too. Now, since Aries again is proactive and action inclined, the first thing I believe Venus in Aries has accomplished was to wake us up from the somnambulant kind of belief or fantasy or dream of Jupiter and Neptune, to which we'd relegated our unconscious, and to begin to take action. So again, spurred by these aspects that I've mentioned, including today's Sun-Uranus combination, the energy has promoted freedom from routine and from the past, and Jupiter's pending move into Aries will represent a kind of wake-up call. Well, I think Venus's move into Aries already represented a kind of wake-up call, and that Jupiter in Aries will expand that. Now, this is further emphasized by Saturn and Aquarius. Remember, Aquarius represents group energy, but Saturn's square to the transiting karmic nodal nodes, which I've mentioned before. In Scorpio, Saturn's still square to the nodal axis and will be through the next eclipse. And that, remember, Pluto is the ruler of the Scorpio South Node, and that he's still currently transiting through Capricorn. So combined with the near midpoint of this current set of eclipses right now, one of them Pluto ruled. And again, bear in mind what I said, it's time for us to excavate the shadow, bring him out into the cold, hard light of day, and reduce him to vapor. Let's vaporize him, once, how the nightmare is so much more frightening in the middle of the night when you're all alone than if you're standing out in a crowd in the middle of the day in Midtown Manhattan, So, again, I remind everyone of what renowned astrologer Bernadette Brady's interpretation of this particular set of eclipses. It's a Saros series set of eclipses, and that these two eclipses, April 30th and May 16th, revolve around the concept of father figures who are ill or ailing. And father figures are authority figures. So whether we take this literally or metaphorically, and I mentioned this last week or the week before, and I'm going to pursue the latter, we can see that we're faced now with coming up against the harsh, restrictive nature of an authority figure, either in the form, where if we stick to this same subject, in the form of the highest court of the land. Remember, Saturn also is the judge. And the fact that the judgment is potentially limiting, if not outright denying us the right to do what we want freely with our own bodies. And most onlookers predict, and did so immediately, that the court will not stop here if this decision comes down the way the draft indicates it could. And with Neptune in Pisces still, this seems a lot like a legitimate concern that such restriction might spread like water. That's my point here. So Jupiter represents the courts, and as it conjoined with Neptune and Pisces on April 12th, it spawned the expansion of a kind of righteousness within the judiciary, in particular this Roe versus Wade case at the least, to rule over the fate of the collective. Another Neptune thing. So Alito's arguments for doing away with the 49-year legal precedent that provided women the legal right to abortion as a constitutional one, it actually lies with the fact that he says abortion in this country is not included specifically in the Constitution. Okay, so he's what they call an originalist, as are the other conservatives on the court, including Gorsuch, Barrett, Kavanaugh, and Thomas. Now, Chief Justice Roberts, who's cited, conservative, mostly kind of middle of the road, except more recently where he has come out a bit more liberal, is a bit wishy-washy, I think, on the originalist stuff. But that only leaves 3 remaining liberal justices to dissent. So no matter how you slice it, the conservatives have a majority, which most of you probably know. But what's been awakened both just prior to and during this eclipse season, remember, eclipse themes tend to manifest about 3 weeks prior to each eclipse, is the hypocrisy behind such issues like the way this court interprets the U.S. Constitution. Critics, in the form of other constitutional scholars, have derided Alito's arguments, which of course were not supposed to be made public, right? That's part of the Sun Uranus, as nothing more than a narrow-minded interpretation of the Constitution with complete disregard for the 14th Amendment's right to privacy clause. Now, there's far more when you get into the legal nitty-gritty of this particular case. However, what I think is interesting, too, is that while Mercury's been slowing down and this draft was leaked, there's been more interest in certain quarters about who leaked it and why they leaked it, rather than attention to what the draft might mean and its potential negative repercussions for Americans in the form mostly of American women. Now, that sounds a lot like Mercury in mutable Gemini to me, which has the connotation at its lowest form for engaging in gossip, hearsay, and, a little bit more of that dog chasing its tail confusion, which is off the point, right? Yes, it's important to the court who leaked the document so they can ensure that such a leak doesn't happen again. And I'm all for that, but it doesn't have anything to do with focusing on that part of the equation rather than what the damn document actually means. So, I'm hoping during this retrograde period, the part in Gemini anyway, before he moves back briefly into values and physical body-oriented Taurus, which will happen from May 22nd to June 14th, that the focus isn't entirely on this more superficial issue, rather than on the value of the right of all Americans to pursue life, liberty, and freedom as they so choose. So when Jupiter enters Aries on May 10th, next week, as I said, it may serve as the sort of secondary to Venus in Aries wake-up call that invites us all to, to start to see some of this as reality rather than just having been dreaming about how wonderful life used to be when our old values prevailed and everybody was, whatever, kind to us and generous. We always see not always, but a lot of us see the past through rose-colored glasses. I mean, that can work both ways too, right? It's like seeing the past through rose-colored glasses. Rose-colored glasses usually implies romanticism. So we may think that the old circumstances or our old relationships were perfect, but it could also imply that we saw them in a more askew fashion, which means not as it really was, which we could also connote to mean we saw it as worse than it really was, right? So I'm just pointing that out. Anyway, just came into my head. But anyway, so Jupiter in Aries will follow on the Venus in Aries energy and serve as a wake-up call since, like I said, this kind of somnambulant energy of Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Pisces. And then, of course, last week we had, or the week before, we had Venus-Neptune conjoined and Venus-Jupiter conjunctions. That was almost a week ago. Which was, for some of us, a very nice energy. But Venus in Aries asks us now, have we slept through a weakening of our true rights under the auspices of Mother Nature's holistic cycles, only to awaken now into the knowledge that it's time for a cyclical reevaluation? In other words, if we follow the cycles of nature, we know that things begin and end and begin and end and begin and end. There's a season for everything, as the Bible says, right? Or the song says. I know the song better than the Bible. But anyway, my point here is that, whether we take this kind of information as an acknowledgement that, it's time to get spurred into action, we really, in our efforts to remain conscious, what's bringing into consciousness is the realization, in other words, that we have to take some kind of action, because if we don't, we just continue to be more and more restricted. And for women, that means being relegated back to the time when one's role was as a housewife and a mother, and pretty much it, and a sex partner. Anyway, so we're looking now at, really taking the kinds of actions that, because we feel so deeply about them, but, as we do that, we can see that, I'm sorry, I'm just sort of, as usual, I think this happens to me every week. At some point in the show, I just completely lose my place. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is that we can turn our minds now, especially again, while Mercury's in Gemini and coming and slowing down to, in its shadow period before it goes retrograde, to kind of revisit some of these things so that we can bring them again into greater consciousness. I've said before that Mercury's retrograde periods, which occur 3 to 4 times annually for about 21 days each, are all opportunities for Mercury, or Hermes, the Greek god, who could traverse between the underworld and Mount Olympus to bring back and forth information in order to make it conscious. So we have a huge time of potential awakening, especially when Jupiter gets into Aries. Now, the Sun is going to sextile Mars in Pisces, the Taurus Sun, on May 7th. And that is also going to give us even more physical energy, even more. The attempt will be to balance our ego energies here, right? And enable us to accomplish whatever work we set our minds to. So that can be on a personal level, but it's also a good time for leadership, providing that we're working toward the needs and desires of others and not just for our own selfish purposes. So again, we're entering a period where we're awakening now to our sense of righteous indignation caused by the righteous hypocrisy of one of the most important, now I'm going back to the Roe versus Wade, one of the most important cases being decided before the High Court now. And remember too, and this is kind of important, that Aries energy is instinctive and instinctual. So it doesn't think, it simply acts or reacts. I think the fact that that story about the Roe versus Wade draft leak, once it had been digested by the media people who then could report on its content, immediately following, people showed up on the steps of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., and then gathered at their state capitals, like I've said a couple of times now. That's instantaneous. So Aries, as an instinctive and instinctual energy, it's kind of that knee-jerk reaction where, you know, we put up our hands. I said this last time. I said, if a baseball is hurtling towards your face at 100 miles per hour, it's your natural instincts that cause you to put your hands up to protect your face, or even just to turn your body away so the ball hits your shoulder instead of your more obviously sensitive face. I mean, that's energy. That's Aries energy. So by the time we get to the May 15, 16 Scorpio full moon lunar eclipse, and the lunar eclipse will manifest more on the internal gut and intuitive level, as I mentioned, I think, last week, we may find the fight is on in full swing. The Scorpio moon will be just past the south node, opposing the sun, and the sun will have just passed the Taurus node at that time. And both luminaries and the nodal axis will be square to Saturn. So the Taurus Sun will perfect its square to Saturn in Aquarius just hours before this lunar eclipse, while the Sun will also sextile Neptune almost immediately following that. And this brings the energies of resistance potentially on both sides of any equation as the Scorpio moon squares Saturn as well, just hours prior to the actual eclipse too. So this intensification, and these are fixed T-square, sets the tone for at least the next 2 weeks of the waning lunar cycle, when we're asked to release again any values which no longer serve us and to replace them with more currently meaningful ones, as I've noted. So as Mercury moves into its retrograde period, Jupiter into Aries starting May 10th, we're already seeing calls for Congress to codify Roe versus Wade into law as kind of a way to save us from this Supreme Court decision, or to lessen the impact of it, or to actually abolish the impact of it. And that's one of the things that's being revealed during this eclipse season, which is, are our elected officials actually working for us, the people who elected them, or for their corporate benefactors? Again, perhaps the tail end energies of Pluto and Capricorn, which also oversaw the 2010 Citizens United decision that allowed corporations to be considered equal to individuals in terms of campaign donations, and opened the door to even more dark money than before in our election campaigns. You know, that this is what may be dying now. But we need to have a little bit of a revolution before it's going to happen. And all in all, I'm guessing we're going to see greater resistance and opposition to the powers that be. And if we use the Supreme Court case as an illustration of these energies, we might then apply them to other circumstances facing both the collective and our personal lives. And here I mean issues such as Pluto's current war against Ukraine, and whether his dream of glorified military prowess will now reach its turning point into the realization of the sad reality that his unprepared and outdated military has illustrated his nation's weakness rather than the strength he'd hoped to project to the world. And we could say the same thing about the Supreme Court here. Are their personal biases their weakness, and their insensitivity to popular opinion at the expense of the dark money that put them there? Another whole, conversation for a different time, is all being exposed now. Now, leading to the eclipse, the lunar eclipse, we'll also see Venus conjoined with Chiron in Aries, another sign that people will be speaking out further, as many already have, about their wounding experiences with both abortion and, on the global scale, with the atrocities inflicted by the Russians against civilians in Ukraine, and fighting for the kind of change in collective values that's already been requested by Uranus and Taurus since the spring of 2018. Now, I believe that abortion is the one issue that will get people out into the streets between now and after the final Supreme Court decision comes down, and that will arrive just in the nick of time, again, before the next set of eclipses next fall on October 25th and midterm election day on November 8th, and that people will still take to the streets, or will, again, if there's a lull during the summer, take to the streets during the tightening of the Saturn-Uranus square from late September to early November this year, and that will affect the midterms too. So part of me feels like the Roe versus Wade, part of me feels like if Roe versus Wade is in fact overturned, that it will become the necessary ingredient to spark a possible backlash leading to the midterm elections in order to prevent a possible total takeover of Congress by a GOP majority. Now, let's look at the past. No one has been out in the streets protesting as our democracy's been swirling down the drain, right? Not until this leak occurred. No one was organizing protests and rallies and buses from all over the country to DC or state capitals, right? And here's where Mercury and transportation-oriented Gemini may change that, along with solidifying a kind of sibling at heart theme of sisterhood now. Whether you're male or female doesn't matter, or whether you identify one way or another, it doesn't matter. So this may also prove true because 26 states stand poised to pull the trigger on their pending legislative efforts to more restrictively outlaw abortion in one form or another as soon as this final decision comes down. So while women's rights to make choices about their own bodies has further and deeper connotations down the line for other issues, and again, we go to the Jupiter-Neptune lingering energy, expansion of this kind of water, this flow, right? This thing will just keep flowing. And that's the fear now, rather than the dream. Well, it is the dream for some, obviously, but for others, it's a nightmare. So we're waking up to that kind of nightmare. Because I'm assuming I don't have a lot of right-wing listeners at this point in my show. And if I do, they're probably out of here by now. So anyway, the implications here are for many different things. Supreme Court future cases that decide gender equality, gay marriage, and more. But also the fact that if Alito's draft is basically followed by the rest of the court, it will do away with a constitutional precedent. Now, we've done that before, and there's again a whole host of arguments about why that was done. Plessy versus Ferguson from the Board of Brown versus the Board of Education on segregation and desegregation. Different story here, right? So you can research that on your own. But the thing is that upending an almost 50-year precedent based on your own personal religious views is not a really good way to gain the popularity of the American public, who's already shown that they don't agree with more restriction rather than less. So, this is in turn what's going to get us up out of our easy chair and out into the streets. And that in turn may affect the outcome of the midterm elections and make it into a one-issue vote. And that is a way that the Democrats might be able to distract people from voting against President Biden's administration and Congress people, Democrats essentially, because they think that he caused inflation, supply chain backups, and unwanted immigration, which is what the propaganda media outlets spew all night after night, to their audiences, and turn more people's attention toward issues they do want to fight for rather than a stupid border war or against paying more for their eggs. Now, I'm hoping this is true, because if not, we're kind of screwed, because in other words, the fight against this pending Supreme Court decision has huge implications, because if it's lost, it will continue to erode the rest of our constitutional precedents. And then it's kind of all downhill from there, because we'll have signed away our country because we watched all this happen from the sidelines. Now, I'm not condemning anyone for that. I'm simply saying, and including myself, because, it's hard to take action as an individual against juggernauts like the Fox News, quote unquote, Facebook, Twitter, Google, etc. And we need a functioning Congress to take these bulls by the horns. So we can start with women's rights, an already litigated issue, and go from there. So, and I wrote, never mind the repercussions of this decision on overturning other precedents blindly, because this court doesn't like the original court's decisions. Forget about it. All right. So anyway, time to sign off. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining me and listening to me today. I hope you found this information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. And please be sure to join me again next week on May 12th for another episode of Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the